Okay, hello and welcome to our next session. This one, for those that you are interested, is going to talk about documenting the COVID-19 pandemic as well as the Black Lives Matter protests. We have four speakers here: Lauren Roberts, who is the Saratoga County historian; Christine Ridarsky, who is the City of Rochester historian; muted. Rob Snyder of Rutgers University, and Devin Lander, the New York State historian, is with us. We want to thank the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State for sponsoring this seminar. As you can see, they were anticipating us being in Oswego, but we weren't quite able to make it there this year. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Lauren and let Lauren get started. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Matt. I am Lauren Roberts, as he just said. So I first started thinking about COVID actually the week that my kids' school was canceled back in beginning of March. I think probably nobody anticipated what was going to happen. So I thought what I would do to begin the session is just kind of go over some of the basic things that you can do mostly from home, if you are working from home or you don't have access to your office, that we should all be doing to start collecting information on how our lives have changed for COVID. And I think, one of the first things that I noticed was all of a sudden when the pandemic started, people were interested in the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic all of a sudden, and people were scrambling to find information about it. And it wasn't, at least for Saratoga County, it wasn't really readily available. It hadn't been collected. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen again, so that inevitably when another pandemic happens sometime in the future, we have really a good archive of what was happening to us, how our daily lives changed, and what the future can learn from that also. So I would emphasize first that whatever you are collecting, however you are collecting it, you need to be aware of doing it safely. So follow all the CDC guidelines, practice social distancing, and make sure that you're protecting yourself and others before you start collecting the information. So I started working from home on March 16th and started thinking about how we were going to start documenting. And the first thing that came to mind was, well, I didn't have access to my office. And I'm sure that's probably similar to a lot of you that work in municipalities. A lot of town halls, city halls, counties were closing to essential workers only. And while we may think historians are essential workers, we can do our jobs mostly safely from home. So many of us were probably not allowed into our office for a time. So I started looking around, what do I have at home that I can use to start documenting? And of course, the internet is probably the most widespread, easily accessible thing to use in trying to document. So you can download newspaper articles from the internet, blogs. I could use my camera. I had my camera at home and start documenting. So those are the things that I started about first. And I think also the amount of information that was coming out from national news, international news, right down to local news, it was all coming at us very quickly, and it can seem overwhelming. So maybe a good tip is just to collect it all and put it in either a COVID, if it's paper documents, put it in a COVID-19 box. If you have the ability to have like an external hard drive, just save everything there, and you can sort it as you go. But while we're in the middle of it, just collect as much as you can, and then you'll be able to sort through it later. So the first thing that I did was start a journal. And when I think about my archives, the things that I look for the most when I'm researching are personal stories, because I think they really get down to to the bottom level of collecting history. So for instance, in my life, I have 2 kids in elementary school, and I was directing a drama club show. And we were doing Annie. We had worked on it for 3 months, and the dress rehearsal night, the school pulled the plug on the play. So the kids never got to perform the show. So in talking to kindergarten through 6th grade about, you know, their disappointment in the show, but why this was happening, why we had to keep people safe, recording their feelings and what was going on in schools was one of the first things that I did, because that was something that was really affecting me in my personal life. So in the journal, I wrote down, you know, as soon as that started, I started writing down anything that would change in your daily life. How did you start getting your groceries? What did the signs look like when you were driving down your street? The arrows on the floor, those types of things. Were you scared? Were you not scared? What was going on in your community? So I think starting a journal is something we can all do, whether you do that on paper or you do that digitally, that's up to you. Whatever works the best for you is fine. The second thing I would recommend is starting a timeline. And I'm going to shout out to Matt Ertz, because he did a great job starting a timeline. And in fact, he has allowed APHNYS to use his timeline as an example, and it's up on the APHNYS website. So if you go to aphnys.org and go under documenting COVID, you can see his, the way that he's broken down his timeline. He started out with international and then national, statewide news, countywide news. He's got them color coded so you can see what was going on internationally versus when local news started coming out and what was happening for him in Madison County. He's a Madison County historian. So I would encourage you to go to the APHNYS website and check out that timeline. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Matt's already done a great job setting that up for us. So take from that, and then you can continue it with your own local stories. The other thing is taking photographs. There are tons of photographs that you can take everywhere. I started around my town with the signs that we were, I actually live on the Great Sacandaga Lake, which is a tourist community, and a lot of people from other places have second homes here, and there was a big influx of people coming in. So the Saratoga County Department of Public Works put up signs encouraging people to quarantine. I took pictures of the signs. I took pictures of the playground at the school wrapped in do not enter tape because the kids couldn't play on playgrounds. And then also take pictures of the uplifting photo signs that were happening too. In our area, we had something called the 518 Rainbow Hunt, where people were displaying rainbows in all different kinds of ways, putting them up in windows, making them out of rock gardens. And it was a way for people to feel connected and uplifted. And you had nothing else to do but drive, go for a ride in your car. So we were all stuck at home. You could drive around and look for rainbows and hopefully feel a little better about the hard situation we were in. The other thing that I did was talking to the departments in the county that had, a really important job in this pandemic. So public health and also our emergency services coordinator, they were having Facebook Live videos about once a week, and they would bring in people from public health, local school superintendents, people from the Chamber of Commerce, local business associations. They can archive that and send it to you, and then you can collect those videos and put them into your archive. And then the last thing that I would emphasize is oral histories or people's stories, recording interviews, and those can be done over Zoom. You'll see, like today, we have recorded all of these sessions on Zoom. You can set up an interview with anyone on Zoom and get their permission and record the interview. And that way you're not actually meeting with anyone in person. No one's health is at stake. And then you can record the interviews and archive them. And you can do this with first responders, doctors, teachers, students, superintendents, small business owners, people in the restaurant field. Matt Ertz actually had another good idea. I think he interviewed an undertaker, which is something I hadn't thought of in my community, but I think that's a really good suggestion. And people that work for grocery stores and things like that. I would suggest keeping the interviews short because these people are busy. They have a lot to do. And if you can only take up 20 minutes or a half an hour of their time, I think that's respectful of them. And it will still maybe allow you to collect that information right now as it's happening. Because I think we all know the importance of not waiting until after the event and then trying to recollect what was going on, but actually in real time collecting the information. And then the last thing I want to say before I pass it on to Devin is that Devin has a great podcast called The New York Minute in History, and I co-host with him. And in early April, we recorded a podcast and Christine Ridarsky and Matt Ertz were on with us. And we talked about what it was like to collect information on COVID. And there is a link to that podcast on the APHNYS website, or you can get it from wamcpodcast.org under a New York Minute in History podcast. So you can listen to the podcast for some other tips. And I think that's about it. So I will mute myself and pass it on to Devin.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everyone, for having me. My name is Devin Lander. I'm the New York State historian, for those who don't know. I co-host the podcast with Lauren. It's our podcast, it's not mine. And it's also WAMC's podcast. So thank you for remembering that, Lauren. And that seemed like a long time ago, but it was only April, but it was in the middle of all of the crisis. So it was a really interesting conversation, and Christine and Matt both had great ideas that they were working on as we were kind of thinking about this problem and this pandemic and how to document it. At the state level, things were a little bit different. Obviously, we were all shut down. We still are. The State Museum, Archives, and Library is closed to the public. We are allowed to come in on staggered days, but the entire staff is not allowed in the building at the same time. We're not open to the public. But immediately when we were all sent home in March, the historians in the museum and archivists and librarians started to think about, what exactly is our role during this as a state agency, as the Office of Cultural Education. Besides kind of the traditional archiving and artifact preservation and things that we normally do, and of course we're going to be doing and are doing for COVID-19, but how do we support the field itself? And obviously all the museums, libraries, archives were shut down. Everyone was sent home. It was a time of great uncertainty about what the future was going to hold, and it still is at some level. So we determined after a series of conversations that we would form a committee within OCE made up of the library, archives, and museums, and talk about how we can provide resources to the field and how we can provide access to information, because that was the most important thing. Is it's somewhat different now, but during the March, April, May, June, there was so much changing on an hour by hour and minute by minute basis, as you all know, that it was hard to keep up with. And so we thought, well, we would try to distill the information, try to gather it, distill it, break it down into format based on, organization type, topic, and so on. So, and we decided that the best way to do that would be to create a website. So I'm going to share the website that we created. Hopefully everyone can see that. So it's the New York State COVID-19 Documentation Initiative. This was the name of the group that was thrown together and tasked with figuring out a mission and a way forward for the agency and ways that we could support the field. So of course our initial mission was broken down into 3 topics: documenting COVID-19, which was, as Lauren just outlined, a vital and important step. All of us who work in this field understand the value of documentation, and we wanted to make sure that we were documenting on behalf of the state itself and the state agencies, that we were documenting the state's response to the pandemic. The second part of our mission we saw as support for cultural organizations. Again, trying to provide information that was accurate and comes from best practices related to things like how to transition your staff to remote, how to think about how to navigate the grant system and the CARES Act and the funding that was made available by the Congress, and how our type of organization could move forward with that. And then also how to, as time went by, how to transition into start thinking about planning for reopening. And many of our organizations are now in that step and in that process, happily. Even in the city now, museums and libraries are opening, and archives are opening happily. But it's a huge process to do. It's a complete transition from normal operating procedure to opening with social distancing, with limited capacity of amount of people. From our own institution's perspective, as we're planned for reopening, again, we're not there yet, although the planning is done. We're ready to go. We just need the green light from the governor's office to be able to open. But we were an institution that does not have docents. We're free, so we don't have tickets. We don't have that type of apparatus set up. We had to really change the way that the State Museum operates. And when we are open to the public, there'll be steps in place to really channel people through one door so that we can manage the amount of people. We also, we're an open museum, meaning when you come in normally, you'd be able to go anywhere you want, any exhibit you want, any direction you want, upstairs, downstairs. We really have to try to limit that so that people are practicing social distancing. So as we're envisioning this at our own institution, we were thinking about other institutions and what they had to do, of all sizes, small, medium, large institutions, and just how you have to rethink your entire outward facing operation. So we were really intent on providing information from a variety of expert sites, accurate information, and keeping up with it as it changed. And then just general COVID-19 pandemic information clearinghouse. This was again, like I said, it's general information on the virus itself and the different kind of changing science that's around it. So really an opportunity for us to try to direct people again to accurate information. So one of the things we did with local documentation efforts, and this is a collection of different initiatives that we've heard of and the people have reached out to us or we heard about or know about in the different regions. And these are initiatives that are happening on the ground. So different organizations, museums, libraries, archives that are documenting COVID directly in their region. And we just link to their work, whatever page, whatever type of media they're using to do this. We just try to link to that and make sure people know where to go in their region if they're interested in seeing who's doing what. It's not comprehensive. It's not fully comprehensive. We attempt to be as comprehensive as possible, but we rely, as with all of this, we rely on people reaching out and letting us know that these things are happening. Then, of course, the Office of Cultural Ed documentation efforts. These are the things that the archives, library, and museum are doing. I can speak directly, and there's information on all three, but I can speak more directly about the State Museum because that's where I work. And I do know that we are extensively collecting material related to the state's response to COVID-19, most especially from the governor's office itself. So much of what you have seen or saw, I guess, with the daily updates that the governor gave, much of that material, including the COVID mountain, for those of you who remember the little paper mache mountain that he created is coming to the State Museum. The wall of masks is coming to the State Museum. All of his presentation material digitally will be coming to the State Museum. And there's much more that the governor's office received from all around the world related to COVID that they've collected and kept. And my colleagues in the curatorial department are in the process of kind of going through that and you know, getting a handle on what it is and whether, you know, what needs to be kept and what doesn't. So that's an ongoing process and continues certainly daily. I know the archives, which, you know, state archives obviously is the archives for state government. They will be collecting material from every state agency as they normally do. And much of which, you know, of course, in the near future will be COVID related. Every agency is dealing with this in its own way. Some more obviously, like Department of Health and the education department where I work, which is dealing with school regulations and school reopenings and all of that. You know, but other agencies as well. I mean, every agency is dealing with this in its own way. So. State Archives' ongoing mission to document the state government continues. The State Library has its own focus on collecting material and especially material related to journals, as Lauren mentioned. They have a project in place where they're collecting for posterity and forever at the state library level, journals that people have kept throughout the pandemic. So again, trying to keep in mind as historians what types of materials we use and what we find useful, and thinking about, you know, where are the blanks going to be in this, and what are the underrepresented voices that are going to result. Certainly not going to be the governor. I mean, the governor's voice is going to be very prominent, but really trying to think of, well, who is not part of that conversation. And that's why I like what Lauren had to say about, you know, possibly at the local level doing oral histories and thinking about, you know, essential workers of all kinds and trying to get their story and their history down, because we sometimes take for granted the effects that this has had on you know, all of us, but specifically people who are deemed essential and the type of work that they do, which is sometimes overlooked or has been in the past. So we also link to national documentation efforts. Of course, there's a lot going on at the national level, National Museum of American History, the all sorts of material there. And a lot of this is clearinghouses themselves. So we just link to what's already there. And then when you click on it, there'll be a lot more information. National Council for Public History is doing a lot so is AASLH, to really need to get them on there. And then we just have general news related to COVID. So as things come across related to either our libraries, archives, or museums, we try to gather that. A lot of this is on reopening. Some of it is on studies that are taking place specifically with paper-related collections about how long the virus actually lives on paper, so that, you know, libraries and archives and museums can be informed about that type of information, which is vital as we think about, reopening lending libraries. And then, as I mentioned before, the support for cultural organizations. We have general COVID information, Department of Health, Education Department, reopening information for libraries, archives, and museums, linking to a lot of national organizations like the American Alliance for Museums, AASLH, on and on, the Association of College and Research Libraries, because every institution is different. They have their own needs and their own publics that they serve. So there's going to be a lot of similarities, but there's also going to be a lot of differences. So we try to be comprehensive on that. The study I mentioned with COVID on paper collections is the IMLS Research Partnership. There's a link to that there. As the science is coming in, we're trying to keep up with that so that organizations are informed. We also have tried to keep up with institutions reopening, although there are a lot more now, happily, and there's more every day. So that is a bit behind. But then we have information on grants and financial relief, as especially for museums right now. This is a very trying time. I've seen estimates ranging from between 20 and 30% of museums may not reopen as a result of the pandemic. So really trying to get information out to institutions about what resources there may be, what financial relief there may be for museums and libraries and archives. So we've tried to collect all of that as we move forward. And I know, of course, the Pomeroy Foundation and its fund for New York State history has been absolutely fantastic, and they just continue to do great work. And the Gardner Foundation in Long Island continues to do great work to support small institutions during this time. But it's a really tough time, and you all know that. I'm not saying anything that's a surprise, but I don't think we've seen anything like this in our field, certainly in our lifetime. So it's important to not only document and to keep in mind, how historical this event is and how important it is to have an archive and a resource for future investigation and future historians. But it's also incredibly vital to understand just how much of a human disaster this has been, not only for those who've lost their lives and their loved ones who are left, but for those who have lost their livelihood and continue to struggle. And it's important for us to we thought at the state level is important for us to keep in mind that this is an ongoing issue, and this is something that is unprecedented in any of our lifetime. And we really have to do a good job in thinking about how do we support these organizations into the future. And, frankly, with the state budgets the way it is and various financial issues going on at the local government level, we're nowhere near out of the woods yet. So this is an evolving project, but it's absolutely essential. I want to say something too, and I think it may have come up in our podcast, but I don't 100% remember because I haven't listened to it in a while. But if you go back to the 1918 influenza pandemic, one of the reasons that there is sometimes a dearth of information available from that at the local level in New York State is because that happened before there were local government historians. As you all know, the local government historians law was passed in 1919, and that was a direct result of the First World War and at some level the influenza pandemic as well. And the state historian realized that there was not an infrastructure in place to document these types of things. And he, especially with World War I, understood that this was a historic time and thought that, if there was this network of local historians available, that they could each document the World War's effect on their community at the local level. So I think that 100 years later, we're poised to document this pandemic in a far more comprehensive way than 1918 and even World War I was documented. And it's really the local government historians who give us that network of historians who can do the work. So that's about all I have right now. Of course, open for questions at the end. But please visit the website. The website is, if you go to the New York State Museum's main site, which is here, you'll see, if you just scroll down, you see the documentation initiative. So that is all available there. We're trying to keep it updated as much as possible, but it goes in fits and spurts. We get a lot of information all at once, and then we don't get a lot, and then we get a lot more. So, and once the decisions have been made at the curatorial level at the State Museum, then there'll be more information about what we actually bring into our collection and what is going to be accessible and exhibited in the future. And with that, I will hand off to Dr. Snyder.
Hi, I'm Rob Snyder. I'm Manhattan Borough historian in New York City and professor emeritus at Rutgers. And I've been working with a group of people who we call ourselves the COVID NYC Documentation Project to try to foster a clearinghouse on COVID documentation projects all around New York City. This project is an outgrowth of early conversations that we began in March, and then a big meeting that we had in April that Christine participated in, all of which stemmed from a common belief in two things. One, we're all wildly ignorant about COVID, about pandemics, about the history of epidemics, and we had to learn a lot. And I began by corralling a few historians of medicine that I knew, and then getting them to field questions from me and from public officials, but then putting together a meeting that we had in April on Zoom that really looked at three things. One was, how do we begin to understand the history of epidemics in the past and how they might help us understand the present? Two, how do we begin to do the work of documenting this awful event that we're going through? We had folks from Columbia Oral History, and Christine talked about the project that she's working on with Pick Story. We had other folks from City Law talking about a project they're doing on the folklore of the pandemic in real time. And then the third part of that, and that really set up the project we're working on now, is how do we begin in a city of 8+ million people to create some meaningful awareness of what we're all doing? Peter Agner of the Gotham Center at CUNY put it really well. How do we avoid needless duplication? How do we help each other? How do we make sure that small community-based organizations get to have their collections put together in a good way? How do we make sure that the voices of essential workers and people living in the neighborhoods that are hardest hit by COVID, how do we make sure their words and their experiences and their feelings get into the record? What was gratifying from early on was how many organizations around New York City are working on COVID. This became clear to us in April, and it only got truer as you pass through the summer and into the fall. Just for example, the Museum of the City of New York has a collecting initiative with Instagram. They've already got an exhibit up. The New York Public Library is collecting narratives. New York Historical Society is collecting narratives and also has an exhibit up. The Columbia Oral History Research Project has a really big oral history project going on right now that is interviewing people as they go through the experience of living with the pandemic. City Law has been collecting folklore of the pandemic, ranging from poetry to photographs that people take of memorials on street corners and things like that. Both the Queens Library and the Brooklyn Historical Society have big collecting projects underway. The Bronx Oral History Project, run out of Fordham, an outgrowth of the Bronx African American History Project, has been doing really, really good work on oral history of living through the pandemic. The Museum of Chinese in America, likewise, has got a big project going and a whole series of online seminars that meet regularly to keep people informed about what's going on. So that, plus a really good website put together by Ellen Noonan at NYU in their public history program, and I put that link up on the chat for people, is what we've been doing in the short run to create a common awareness of our different historical documentation projects around the city. For the longer run, we want to try to create a coordinated clearinghouse. It's an ambitious effort, and a bunch of us have been meeting since early in the summer. And we are now about to start fundraising to hire a digital archivist who will survey exactly what's being done around New York City in COVID documentation. And we hope to have that underway really soon. We're working with the Manhattan Borough president on that to raise money for that. And we've got a digital archivist in mind because so much of the material that we're looking at is born digital. We've got to figure out a way to get that stored and put into a useful format for people in the future. At the same time, I think that in the long run, the digital dimension of this project will be important because I think any meaningful collection that has the widest public access possible is going to have a big digital presence, a big digital hub perhaps. And how we do that is something that's still very much up in the air. It's possible to be too ambitious on this. And in that version, we talk about a WorldCat for all the COVID collections in New York City. But it's possible also to not shoot high enough on that. And we're trying to really get the right combination of outreach and avoiding duplication and making things available to people in the long run. Our big concern, the thing that haunts me, and it's something that folks have mentioned already, is we don't know where this ends. There's a sort of background feeling in New York City right now that we haven't seen the second wave and it's coming. And on one hand, you can be optimistic about that because we know a lot more than we knew back in March and April. At the same time, there's a feeling that nobody wants to go through again what we went through before. And we'll see how everyone responds to that. That in the short run creates an obstacle. But since we don't know the end point, how do we understand the process as we've lived through it? Because we're trying in the COVID documentation project to think about this in the most generous and broad-based terms, not just the virus, right? But all the events, the Black Lives Matter protests, the police violence, all the events that for which the COVID experience forms a context. We're looking at all these things. There's a ton of work being done by photographers and videographers on protest, for example. We want to try to make sure that gets a good digital home someday. But we've got our hands full in the short run, but I think in the long run, we'll create a richer record, a deeper history where many, many voices are heard, from ordinary folks living in neighborhoods to essential workers to people who work in city government. I think putting all that together is going to take a while, but I think we've taken a first step that's really useful. And with that, let me hand it off to everybody else.
So I will pick up here. I think most of you know me. I'm Christine Ridarsky. I'm your APHNYS president this year. And we're running a little short on time, so I may not get through my full presentation, but I wanted to do a couple of things. And first, I wanted to start by talking about some of the projects that APHNYS has created. When the pandemic hit and we started to talk about the need to document what was happening in real time, APHNYS wanted to offer tools to our members. And I already earlier put a link in the chat to the initial information that we released, which is still on our new website. And that Lauren talked about a lot of those things that we were recommending at that point. One of the first tools that APHNYS created for our members was a Google form that members could use. And this was something that a lot of organizations were doing at that point in time. And this was just a way we could put this out. We could push it through social media or web context, whatever we had. And it allowed people just to fill in some information. We asked them to put in the date when they were completing the survey, with the understanding that they could potentially complete a survey every single day or every few weeks, and we could be able to see how their experiences were changing over time. And then we just had a number of questions about, how they felt initially, what was changing for them, how their behavior has changed. If there were a business owner, what was happening with that, asking them about their local government response, those types of things. And then we also here at the end give them the opportunity to upload files of their own. So if they have photographs from their own community, things they've been taking and documenting in the community, they could upload those here. We have now collected, I believe the last number when I looked was 102 responses to this survey, and they're coming in from, all across the state. And our intention as a statewide organization is to eventually curate these and share these back to the communities from which they came. So we'll be working with all of you, all of our historians, to get this information back into your community. So that's why we see this as a tool for you to use, because we're going to make sure that it comes back to you. It might not happen overnight, because we don't want to share anything until we've curated all of it and see what's here and actually have time to do that. But this is something you can use, and it will come back to your community, and you'll see that there is a place within here where we're asking people to share their village, town, city, and their county so that we can get these out to the historians. As we started to move forward with the pandemic, we decided that we wanted to do a little bit more than just a written narrative, and that I personally am someone who work with oral history quite a bit, and I've been influenced heavily by the work of a professor named Michael Frisch out of the University at Buffalo. And Mike was a past president of the Oral History Association. He's very experienced in this field and has been innovating ways to make oral history more useful to researchers and to the public. And so he, about a couple years ago, launched a new social media platform known as PicStory, and they've recently improved that even more. And what his platform does is it allows people to combine the format of photography or imagery with oral history recordings, and it allows people to do this themselves. So in this era of COVID, when a lot of us were stuck at home and we couldn't go out and do interviews, this is a way that people could sort of interview themselves in a way and contribute. And so we started the PicStory version of our Witness to History project. And if you go to the link, you come to this page that explains our project. We have a tip sheet that I can share with you in just a minute that it walks people through the process. And then it allows people to contribute their own stories. And I have really grown enamored of this project. So far, we haven't collected as many stories as we would like. There's about 25 or 30 on there now. But there are just some wonderful stories on here. And I'm going to try to share a couple with you because I think it can demonstrate a little bit about how this format can be useful, because these are short interviews. They're not people sitting and talking for an hour. They're just people telling short stories. And so here's one from someone we may all recognize.
I think I'm handling my mail.
I'm sorry, that was the wrong one. Let me play this one.
With an overabundance of caution, which is a very well-worn phrase in this day of the COVID-19 pandemic, I am handling how I get my mail differently than I used to. My mail comes through rural route delivery, so I get it in a mailbox, bring it into the house, handling it as little as I possibly can, and I put it in this basket, spray around with disinfectant, wash my hands, and I let the mail sit for 3 days to sort of cure and make sure the nasty germs have died. I may be a little overreacting. You should see me when I come back from the grocery store. But that's one of the things I'm definitely doing differently since the COVID-19 pandemic.
Christine, the sound is pretty low. People are not able to hear it that well.
Okay, let me adjust.
I just turned up the volume on my computer and I heard it fine.
Okay, so if you wouldn't mind doing that, because I'm not seeing my controls on my screen at this point in time, I think because I have the share up. So the other thing I like about this platform is it allows us to create a dialogue too. So you've just heard Ray's story, and then somebody went in and listened to his story, and they actually had a response to it. And so let me play that for you.
I think I'm handling my mail too soon. I like your idea. We're going to learn from each other by listening to these stories, I think. I usually just leave my mail in the mailbox till the next day and pick it up. I don't know why I made up that rule myself, but I think now I'm going to leave it in a basket at least for a day or two. I don't need to look at it that quickly, and maybe I'll be doing myself a favor. So thank you very much, Delaware County, for your advice. And you're not overreacting. I may compromise a little and shorten that time a little, but I will take a little bit of what you have taught me.
And so those stories were recorded very early in the pandemic, but we've had people who have continued to contribute since then. And here's one that came in more recently as things started to reopen a little bit.
Well, as we all prepare to gradually re-enter the world after being cooped up at home, here's what I have that I need to do that. On the left is the ever-present bottle of hand sanitizer, and then I have a selection of masks for every occasion. On the left is an N95, but the most protection as a ventilator mask is needed. But in most everyday things, I choose one of the other two. On the bottom is a plain, everyday black mask made by a company in Buffalo, New York, in fact. And in the center is kind of a dress mask. It's a beautiful mask made from African fabric by a Buffalo company called African Monarchy. And this mask has actually taken on a whole new meaning in the context now of the Black Lives Matter moment that has overtaken the COVID-19 moment or become blended together with it. And so wearing this is now a way to, in a very modest form, to express solidarity and support and identification with the Black Lives Matter struggle.
So you see that by using this project and allowing people to contribute all throughout, we have representations from different stages in the pandemic as well. And there's something about being able to look at something visual and talk about it. And I think a lot of us who do oral history have experienced that as well. Often if you take props with you to an oral history interview, give them photographs or maps or something to refer to, it will sort of prompt stories. And that's the method behind this, is that we're asking people to share photographs or images. They can share their own artwork if they like, and then to use that as a jumping off point to talk about it. So those are the two projects that APHNYS really has been focusing on and have been encouraging all of you to use. And if you hadn't been familiar with these yet, I hope that you will take these back to your community. You know, it's as easy as sharing a link on your Facebook page or your website, or emailing it out to people you work with and asking them when it's convenient for them to participate in this. The other thing I thought I would just show you real quick too was the tip sheet that we had here. Let me find it. So we also have this tip sheet that's up on the website as well. And this really is everything you need and everything a participant needs to contribute a story. And it just walks you right through all of the steps to recording a PIC story. And, you know, should give people anything they need, there's also more examples here that you can click on. The thing to know is that right now this is set up as a private group, so you need to have an invitation to join, and then it's just a simple process to create an account, and then you can contribute. So I hope that some of you will use that in your communities and continue to push that out. And again, all of the recordings that we capture will be available online, but they also will be shared back to the individual communities as well. So I had intended to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement a little bit as well, because certainly these two movements are overlapping. And we're running out of time, and I wanted to make sure that we have time for questions. But one of the things I just really want us to think about is what are we doing? What are we collecting? Why are we collecting it? And are we the right people to be collecting and interpreting this history? And one of the things that I've been really resisting is pressure within my own community to start documenting what's happening. You may be aware that here in Rochester, we've got our own case of police brutality that resulted in the death of a Black man. It happened back in March before the George Ferguson case came to light, but we only just learned about it here in Rochester. And so we've had protests in our city every night for the past several weeks. And so there's been a lot of pressure to document this movement. You know, even before our own Daniel Prude case, there was pressure to start documenting this. And as a result of that, I've been doing a lot of research, and it's made me think a lot about the rush to document things like COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I've been doing some reading, and I've shared a couple of websites here with you that I won't really go into. But the question we're asking is, first of all, for the Black Lives Matter movement, is should white people and white-led organizations be the ones who are documenting and interpreting Black people's stories? Are we the right ones to be deciding what we should be collecting and what the story is? The other thing to think about, and this applies to COVID as well, is now the right time to be documenting? People are experiencing a lot of trauma right now. And is it ethical for us to be intervening in their trauma? One of the things that Ira Tanzi, one of the articles that I refer to, that I gave you the link for, one of the things that she writes is that there's something really unsettling about archivists, particularly those from institutions which don't have a great track record of supporting their most marginalized workers or constituents, suggesting that the historical record should be a high priority while people are trying to keep their shit together and attempt to not die. So, you know, is now the time? And the other thing is that we need to be thinking about the effects of the work that we're doing now and in the future. And so she's arguing that if you're out there documenting protest activities, what's your plan for when law enforcement or others come to subpoena your material and your attempts at documenting for the future actually endangers people's lives in the present by making them the target of law enforcement? And she argues that, and she says this is not hypothetical, and her article gives examples of cases where this has happened and historical records have been used to persecute and prosecute people. So she's arguing that if you're going to do that sort of thing, you need to have a plan in place for how you're going to handle that if it does turn out that you're creating a record that can harm other people. So we've got a plan in Rochester that's still in development, and I'm not going to go through all of this because we just don't have the time, and I want to open it up to questions. But I am open to discuss the work that we're doing in Rochester, and I'm open and eager for input from other people who are grappling with this issue, because, you know, it certainly is important in Rochester, and it's going to be something that we're going to need to deal with. And with that, I'm going to close out my section of this and open it up for questions to all of our panelists.
There were a couple, one question in particular that came up that Rob did respond to, but just in case everybody didn't see it, Jason was asking about a way to record phone interviews for those who are not comfortable or have access to Zoom. And so the response from Rob is in the chat as well. And I'll let you weigh in on that. You're
Rob,
muted.
Okay, hear me? Yeah, a lot of the great questions that Christine raised come up at the intersection of history and journalism, and that's a place where oral history has long lived. And if people are uncomfortable being interviewed over Zoom, I would explore with them the possibility of being interviewed over a telephone. As a young journalist, I used really simple recording devices to record people that I interviewed over a telephone. It's nothing more than basically, you know, a pickup which affixes to your phone handle and then goes into your recorder on a jack. There are digital versions of that today that are a little more sophisticated, but very easy to use. I think they're great ways to record people with their permission. I think that's the key, with their permission. When you're interviewing them and they don't want to work over Zoom and they feel uncomfortable about Zoom.
And I just added in the chat that I think some cell phones, depending on your service provider and your phone, actually have built-in capabilities to record phone calls now. So you might want to check into your own devices too. Are there other questions about any of these issues? What have your own experiences been? What have you been doing? Jason, did you have a thought or a point you wanted to make?
Sorry, here I'll go audio since it's quicker than typing.
Okay.
While you were talking about the morality and ethical questions about the Black Lives Matter, there's also the question that I thought of is about our own safety, because we've seen that journalists are not protected at these protests documenting these things. What hope could we have if we were to go to these too?
Can I
That's a
respond
great-
to that one, Christine?
Oh, please go ahead. Matt?
I documented 2 protests that took place in Madison County. I notified, again, sure, I can start my video. Oops. I can tell you that I talked to our sheriff, our lieutenant, explained what I was doing, and they basically said, just stay out of the way. Document what you have to document, do what you can. If things start to get hairy, it's probably best that you leave. So I followed those orders, and obviously ours, in our case, was very peaceful. But it gets back to that same thing with COVID. You should not put yourself in a situation where you are in danger. And if you are representing a community that has a law enforcement that's going to be part of this, and in our case, the law enforcements were all notified in advance, it makes sense for you to let them know what you're doing. That way they're aware. And in my case, they had me wear my county ID stuff. So, but that's what I would do. You know, you want to make sure you're working with the parties involved and let people know what you're doing.
You know, and this is a big question for me and Michelle here in Rochester right now, because it gets politically tricky too, right? Because, you know, with the situation here in Rochester, the protesters are calling for the resignation of our mayor, who is our appointing person. So we have stayed clear of the protests for any purpose, simply because of, you know, the implications of being associated with the protesters in any way at this point in time. So I think you also have to, you know, really understand the situation in your own community too, before you go out there and, you know, think about what it means for your community and your position.
I guess it's useful if you can't personally go to perhaps cultivate other people who can and do it in an independent way. And something I learned a long time ago as a reporter is that in difficult situations, look at the people around you. And I used to look to journalists who are much older than me. And if they got nervous, I figured I should be nervous. But until they got nervous, I thought that the spookiest situation was probably a lot safer than I thought. And that turned out to be correct, right? It's a very difficult situation that we're living through, and it makes really incredible demands on all of us. And it's useful to try to respond with some ingenuity, but also some things that people learned in the past.
And then the question is too, is through whose lens are we viewing protests? And this is where, you know, one of the things we've been doing in Rochester is we've been cultivating connections within the Black Lives Matter community for several years now. And that's one of the reasons that I've become so aware of some of these questions as well. And so, you know, it helps to be having conversations with people who are involved in these protests and these movements themselves, and not just your white peers, but, you know, people who are protesting for their own lives and livelihoods. And, you know, ensuring that we're documenting through their lenses as well. And that can be very tricky when, you know, most of us, you know, we know most of our historians are white, probably middle-class people, and the institutions we're working for are also white-led and dominated. And so I think it's something that we all need to step back and think about. And the Inclusive Historian's Handbook can be useful in this as well, as we heard this morning.
Yeah, we have some political shenanigans going on in Saratoga County related to COVID. And I'm guessing that Lauren is staying clear of that. Lauren, are you there?
She's shaking her head yes.
Oh, okay.
Here she comes.
Yes, John, I'm
You
steering
know about
clear
it.
of that.
John, do you want to elaborate at all?
Not really, because my supervisor's involved with it too.
Okay.
Do you want to briefly tell them what it's about, Lauren?
No, I don't think I want to get into it. All I'll
Okay.
say is that when you are a municipal historian, you are an appointed position, which makes it a difficult field when you are pulled in different directions politically. And, you know, I think it's a hazard of the job, and I think we have to do our best to document what we can, to not take political sides in what we're collecting or how we're interpreting it, but to collect information from both sides and to do our jobs. But I do absolutely recognize that sometimes historians get caught up in, and this is certainly not just municipal historians right now, but it's such a politics across the nation are it's just such an inferno. It's hard for you to stay out of it, but because we're political appointees or municipal appointees, you do get caught up in it, and it's a very difficult field to navigate.
And on that note, we are now over time. So this is
there was a question I noticed on the chat about the State Museum and Black Lives Matter, and I didn't talk about that, but I should. Certainly the museum is actively collecting material related to the movement as well, but I echo Christine and her caution as we move forward, and all of us are thinking about this as we think about current events in general, but specifically Black Lives Matter is you know, forcefully kind of going out and asking for material versus letting people decide to donate it or suggest to give it to us. We're erring on the side of that. And we are getting material. Also, I have a colleague who works in the actual collection side of the museum, unlike me, who is working with Rensselaer County Historical Society on helping them document Black Lives Matter in the city of Troy, which was the scene of several protests over the summer, as was Albany. as was most of our communities. And moving forward with that organization to work with the community and help the community kind of decide what it decides to keep. And this is such an ongoing thing, just like COVID. We don't know where this is going to end. So there's that in the back of our minds. But I think just like the Women's March, when that happened, we were acquiring material, the day after those marches, and it's a similar thing now. It's the decisions are still being made on what to keep and all of that, what to accession, but it's a constant conversation that we all have to have. So I'm glad that we were able to talk about it.
Okay, and now we are
Way
over
over.
time, so I appreciate everyone participating. We certainly can continue these conversations maybe tomorrow and in regional meetings and future conferences. So, let us know, stay in touch with your regional coordinators and with the APHNYS board, and let us know what you're thinking about and what you'd like to see us arranging and doing for you along these lines. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow morning. The first session tomorrow is the Registered Historians Training. So if you are thinking of applying to become a registered historian, you'll want to get up bright and early and join that session at 8:30, and you'll hear from expert registered historians on how to navigate the process of becoming one yourself. And then at 9:45, we have a session on historic markers and primary sources that will be presented in part by the Pomeroy Foundation. And of course, in the afternoon, our APHNYS annual meeting. So join us tomorrow. We look forward to seeing you. Thank you.
And don't forget, 11 o'clock, the New York State Archives tour.